Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second keynote address for our conference. Once again, my name is Silvia Gaspari, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Italian Studies at the University of Toronto. And I am also one of the organizers of this conference. So just like we've been doing with all of our panels, I just wanted to take a brief moment to remind people how Crowdcast works. As you may have seen, when you are in the general conference page, you can navigate to different sessions by clicking on them. Once you have entered a session, you can write any comments in the general chat, and that's the chat that appears here on the right-hand side of your screens that says, say something nice. So that is dedicated for comments about the panel, if you would like. There is also a dedicated chat area for questions, and that is just underneath the video feed, and it's called the Ask a Question section. So if you do have a question for Professor Saber that she will address at the end of her talk, please write it in the Ask a Question section. And our moderator, my colleague Benedetta Lamanna, will be monitoring the questions today for us. Now it is my very great pleasure to present Professor Arielle Saber from Bowdoin College. She is a professor of Romance Languages and Literatures at Bowdoin. Professor Saber's books include Images of Quattrocento Florence, Writings on Literature, History and Art, co-edited with Stefano U. Baldassarri, published by Yale. Giordano Bruno and the Geometry of Language, published by Routledge in 2005. And Measured Words, Computation and Writing in Renaissance Italy, published by University of Toronto Press in 2017. Professor Saber publishes on Dante, medieval and Renaissance Italian literature, and the history of mathematics, as well as on science fiction, electronic music, and reception of Dante in the arts. In 2006, she founded the crowdsourced digital archive Dante Today, Sightings and Sightings of Dante in Contemporary Culture. She is currently working on a series of essays on Dante and a study of the non-human in Renaissance humanism. Professor Saber's talk for us today is entitled Adrenaline Pulses in the Cables of Reality, the Techno-Humanist Imaginatio of Italian Science Fiction's Connectivist Movement. Professor Saber, to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Does this sound, it sounds okay, the volume's okay, great. It's really a great pleasure to be here today at the University of Toronto with wonderful colleagues and future colleagues, with longtime friend and renowned Dante scholar Deborah Parker, whose talk was amazing yesterday, with the great writer of science fiction, horror, fantasy, and social activism, Valerio Evangelisti, and pioneering science fiction scholars, translators, editors, Domenico Gallo, and Professor Luca Somigli. I would very much like to thank the graduate students, as many people have been, but it's wonderful to be able to do this. They've done a great job. The graduate students at the Department of Italian, Elisabetta Carraro, Silvia Gaspari, Benedetta Lamanna, and Nata Paul Ruranzvi for the excellent organization of this event. And I also put down all the wonderful people who are involved in this event. And I want to also say hello to Nicholas Terpstra, who knows me mostly in my medieval Renaissance hat, and he's seeing me in a different subfield that I do, which is science fiction. And I promise you they are connected. So here is the list of the wonderful institutions and departments and centers that have supported this conference, as well as the Consulate General of Italy and the Canadian Association for Italian Studies. So the topic of this conference, memory and imagination in Italian science, in Italian fiction and nonfiction, is a fascinating one. And it's one that once you enter, it's very hard to leave. A little bit of personal background here. In my junior year, I went to the Università di Bologna, way back in the last century. And it was there that I first encountered the Renaissance maverick philosopher Giordano Bruno in a course taught by a professor of philosophy who focused on aesthetics, Paolo Bagni. The course title, and I'll never forget it, was called La metafora e la memoria. The readings and discussions lit up not only the aula and lobes of my brain, but the path I would travel, and actually the aula and lobes of my brain, but the path I would travel from that point on. A year later, Bruno became the focus of my laurea in philosophy back home in America on the concept of the imagination as the shuttle between the many and the one. 4 years after that, he was the focus, actually a few more years after that, he was the focus of my PhD thesis that would turn into my first book on the intersection of geometry and rhetoric in his thought and writing. Although I did not focus, and I have not focused on Bruno's mnemonics, one cannot study him without engaging his ars memoriae, of course. And just as there was never a doubt in Bruno's mind, there has never been a doubt in mine that memory is a creative, imaginative faculty, as this conference is showing. We all know, for example, how memory can become overzealous in its recalling of past experiences, creatively reworking them into new narratives that protect us from reliving pain or trauma, or into recollections of data that serve to boost our sense of self and identity. Fascinating work has been done and is being done by psychologists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists in exploring just how selective and creative memory is. As Bruno and many mnemonists, artists of memory, before and after him have shown us, memory as a combinatoric art is not just something we use for recalling images, words, and experiences of the past, but a dynamic force that picks up momentum over time, pushing us outward, beyond ourselves, and into the future. Bruno said it well, or shall I say, molto brunamente, in a prefatory sonnet to his metaphysical dialogue, Dell'infinito universo et mondi, from 1584. I'm going to cite this in full, as its verses will find echoes in the Italian science fiction collective, the Connectivists, I will be presenting today. And I don't have the English, I apologize. If anyone is interested in English translations, I'm happy to send them after the conference. E chi m'impena, e chi mi scalda il core, chi non mi fa temere fortuna o morte, chi le catene ruppe e quelle porte onde rari son sciolti ed escon fuore, le tadi, gli anni, i mesi, i giorni e l'ore, figlie ed armi del tempo e quella corte, a cui né ferro né diamante è forte, assicurato manda il suo furore. Quindi l'ali sicure all'aria porgo, né temo intoppo di cristallo o vetro, ma fendo i cieli e all'infinito mergo. E mentre dal mio globo agli altri sorgo, e per l'etereo campo oltre penetro, quel che altri lungi vede, lascio al tergo. Slicing the heavens and rising towards the infinite, toward a larger view of ourselves, our world, our place in the universe, and our understanding of human purpose. This is the mission of many explorers that have shared this mission with Bruno. Scientists, philosophers, theologians, poets, artists, and of course, science fiction writers. When we ask what if, or speculate on what could be, we must start by seeing what is, and imagining this here and now as both the consequence of what was and as the starting point for what will be. To do that, we need memory, ours and that of others, and we need the imagination. A group of science fiction writers and artists in Italy that I met a number of years ago look at the world just in this way, I would argue, consciously, intentionally, through memory and imagination. They combine not only ideas of today, but ones from the past in order to extrapolate new ways of being in this world for tomorrow, ways that are more conscious of the connective tissue between people, nations, generations, species, spaces, and more. This collective of writers and artists, aptly called connectivisti, seeks the threads that link us to the world around us, above and below, past and future. Where they don't see these threads, they look for ways to create them, ways to weave nets that support life on this planet in all its forms, ways to evoke empathy and understanding. While much of their work could be considered dystopic and even dyschronic, with pessimistic imaginings of a post-singularity economic, climate and social collapse, they open doors of hope for change in their darkest critiques of modern society. Hovering in the interstices between their words are flashes of this hopeful, albeit strange, world and worlds. And I would say non-places like Marc Augé, heterogeneous spaces a la Foucault, ambiguous spaces like Ursula Le Guin and Samuel Delany, inner spaces like Ballard, virtual spaces like Nick Bostrom. And like Philip K. Dick, the connectivists look obliquely at reality and are unconvinced that we actually know what is real. They stand on conceptual edges that veer into mysticism, the avant-garde, new techno-science, as well as the edges that hybridize all of these. They straddle genres from noir to climate fiction to the fantastic and the new weird. Returning often to the cyberpunk street, they, quote, find their own uses for things, quoting from William Gibson's Burning Chrome, of course. Connectivist works can estrange us from our notions of what is, as Darko Suvin characterized to be science fiction's main formal device, and their works force us to contemplate what science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson has called the history we cannot know. Although it is provocative to say what I'm about to say, connectivism demonstrates what science fiction critics, Mark Bold and Cheryl Vint wrote, quote, there is no such thing as science fiction. I came across the Connectivisti in 2012. It was their 2004 manifesto, presented on their website without flash or fuss, that grabbed my attention. And here, this is just part of their manifesto. The 10-point statement began with the same verb the futurists used in their opening point, cantare. While the futurists wish to sing of l'amor, del pericolo, l'abitudine, l'energia, e la temerità, the connectivists will sing of la resurrezione dell'anima consumata nella tecnologia. While the futurists' second point spoke of il coraggio, l'audacia, la ribellione as the core elements of their poetry and art, the connectivists claim deragliamento dei sensi, le corrispondenze analogiche e la rottura del controllo as the strumenti fondamentali of their ricerca. A brief preface to the manifesto states the following. Siamo i custodi della percezione, guardiani degli angeli caduti in fiamme dal cielo, lupi siderali, un gruppo di liberi sognatori indipendenti. Viviamo nel cyberspazio, siamo dappertutto, non conosciamo frontiere. Upon my first reading, of course Giordano Bruno flashed through my mind, as did Galileo, Dante, Milton, Philip K. Dick, Delany, Le Guin, Ballard, who I've already mentioned, the noir, the Gothic, and the wolf as a symbol of Rome, of the state, of the church, of covetousness, as Dante would have it, and as the animal tamed by St. Francis, wolves transported to the stars. These were not neo-futurists. The manifesto first point continues. La notte, il sogno, la visione e la connessione e tutto ciò che sublima le nostre anime a un ordine superiore di conoscenza. This collective, as we will see, is a curious admixture of mysticism, Eastern and Western, cyberpunk, and new wave science fiction sensibilities. Also, avant-garde experimentation, interests in contemporary physics, environmentalism, classical philosophy, epistemology, cognitive science, bioethics, theories of the post and transhuman, sound, music, art, sexuality, and a celebration of pop culture. And I know that's a lot. Alessandro Bavari, and I'm not sure if it's Bavari or Bavari, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, photo montage that you see here was included in the collective's magazine called Next in 2012. And I feel like this image fuses many of the themes and inclinations that we can take in at a single glance. Like a number of Italy's self-abnegating literary collectives, Luther Blizet, Wu Ming, Kaizen, The connectivists worked often at the beginning under nom de plume and seemed to be inclined towards a sort of self-erasure, erasure of self and the individual, as they state in point 8. Non abbiamo nomi, il nostro vero nome è un sussurro nel buio, un rumore nascosto nella radiazione di fondo dell'universo, un segnale immerso nel rumore bianco della materia. Il nostro nome vaga, libero nella notte. A few of these plumes can be seen here in the collective's magazine Next. And I just highlighted a few. We've got X and Zune and Piekmeal. Those are a few of the original founders of the movement, as I'll explain later. For the most part, however, the connectivists do use their real names for their published novels and short stories, and occasionally they write collaboratively. They do celebrate the individual, the unique connections each individual has with others, ideas, and the world around them, yet further complicating the issue of their status as connected individual selves is how the manifesto acknowledges that its members are often lone wolves. Quelli che camminano da soli per strada, quelli sospesi tra l'illusione del mondo virtuale e l'inganno del mondo reale. They seem to intentionally oscillate between negation of the io and the importance of the io in the web of human consciousness and communication and survival, between the solitary and the group. And as their concluding line emphasizes, between nothingness and the notion that noi saremmo tutto. Their website is called Next Station, and I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is just a clip from their website, echoing the next of their zine, and these are a few covers of their, a few issues of their zine called Next. So these nexts not only reference the idea of the future, or as my beloved Leon Battista Alberti would put it 600 years ago, quid tum, what's next? But the computer and software company founded in 1985 by Steve Jobs after he was forced out of Apple. He started a company called Next. The Next computer, actually, by the way, was the world's first web server and ran the world's first web browser in 1990. The Next is also more than a nod to the science fiction author A.E. Van Volt's neologism, nexialism, which is a term he coined for a generalist, interdisciplinary kind of science in his 1950 novel, Voyage of the Space Beagle. This Italian science fiction collective has, in fact, affiliated itself with powerful visionaries. Connectivism's platform clearly invokes this interdisciplinarity, intergenrearity, interactivity, collaboration, and celebration, I would say, of pantarei and binaries. They consciously toggle between dualities, as you've already seen, and I'm going to list a few others. So between self and other, human and machine, order and chaos, heterogeneity and unity, edges and nodes, earth and universe, sleeping and waking, reader and writer, spiritualism and materialism, immanent and transcendent, continuity, discontinuity, real and not real, and of course, solitude and connection. Fascinated by what I saw in their manifesto and on their website, I began reading their work and talking with them. And in 2013, in person, at a science fiction convention in Bellaria, Italy, called Italcon, I interviewed 5 connectivists, 2 of the founding 3 members and 3 later arrivals. I learned that everything started with an early version of a website called Club G Host in the early 2000s, where Sandro Battisti, here, and Marco Milani, here, published their writing. Giovanni De Matteo, here, published his first story there, and Battisti then invited De Matteo to contribute work to his personal blog called CyberGoth. Within a year or so, De Matteo launched his own blog, Junction, to offer a place for a growing collective of writers and artists with a shared vision of what science fiction could be. That's one of the things I love about them, is that they actually are continually engaging the question of what is science fiction. Milani also curated a site called Domisticon, but it was on Cybergoth Junction, and it was on Cybergoth Junction and Domesticon that connectivist ideas began forming. In 2003, Giovanni De Matteo wrote the first version of the manifesto that you've seen parts of already, but it wasn't published until 2004. By 2006, Battisti, Milani, and De Matteo inaugurated their website, Next Station. Their magazine, Next, started in 2005 with number 00, the Esordi, which each issue offered between 50 and 100 pages. 18 numeri were published, ending the run in 2012 with the aptly titled theme of I, Next, instead of I, Robot, but it could be interpreted in a number of ways. In 2009, they published an 80-page issue in English called Next International. And in 2011, Next won Italy's fanzine prize called the Premio Italia. Each Next is filled with columns on current technology and science, a rich poetry section, which I really value and find fascinating, a narrative section, a visual art section, a list of connectivist happenings, which can be conferences, readings, radio shows, short films, etc., and more. Within a few years, a number of others joined the connectivist group, 3 of whom I met also in Bellaria. Gianluca Cremoni Baroncini, also known as Cremo. He's also a musician and a publisher. Writer and publisher Francesco Verso, and writer Giovanni Agnoloni, also known as Cosmos. Writer Marco Moretti, also known as Antares 666, who I did not meet in 2013, joined later, as did writers and editors, and I don't have pictures of them, Alex Tonelli, known as Logos, Domenico Mastro Pasqua, known as 7 of 9, Sette di Nove, Mario Gazzola, known as Marca Sente, and Roberto Furlani, known as Rho, the Greek letter, and others. This next part is, I think, such a riot. In the interview in Bellaria, I could see that they had great respect for one another. And I am going to point out the fact that there are no women. I'm getting there. At one point, someone said that Giovanni De Matteo was the collective's brain. Clearly improvising, they decided unanimously that Cremo was the collective's heart, Sandro, the wings, Francesco, the legs, Marco Milani, the skin. And I'm glad they stopped there. But I wanted to know what the other members thought of themselves as part of this body, this collective. I spoke with Tonelli, Gazzola, and Moretti, and Tonelli thought he would be the emotions, Gazzola, who works a lot with music, the ear, Moretti, the liver, and I love his quote, he said, inflamed, full of toxins and gall, the center of every irrational passion. And Giovanni Agnoloni, I imagined something for him and then checked with him. I imagined him as the spirit. And when I proposed it to him, he did agree. So although there have only been around 30 adherents, connettivisti, at their height, and they are down to about 20 now, and what adherent actually means is not clear, as the collective is intentionally informal and open and fluid. Their Facebook page has over 250 members, 261 as of early March. These are what I would call connectivist adjacent authors. They are artists, musicians, playwrights, filmmakers, journalists, publishers, scholars like me in America, and readers. People they would call, and this is their term, compagni di strada. While no women, here we get to this question, were among the founding members of the group, they actually have worked to include them. As of now, about 25% of the members and compagni are women. I have not met any of them yet, but I have definitely been emailing with them and speaking with them. A few of the prominent women, writers and artists in the movement, or again, adjacent compagni di strada, are Xenia Lagigna, Linda De Santi, Laura Silvestri, Federico Leonardi, Franci Conforti, Valeria Barbera, Irene Drago, which is her pen name. I don't have a picture of her. And the unfortunately recently deceased Francesco Fichera. She died just a year or two ago, who was the only woman writer in their anthology Nuove Eterotopie, l'antologia definitiva del connettivismo from 2017. A year later, however, in 2018, and they won the prize in 2019, but it was published in 2018, there were 9 women out of 17 authors in the award-winning anthology Next Stream Visioni di Realtà Contigue. Unfortunately, we dipped down in 2019 to 5 out of 23 in La Prima Frontiera. So few of the women with whom I've been speaking would call themselves connettiviste or connettiviste, and again prefer to be called compagne di strada. La Gigna is also an artist. She was the designer of this beautiful mysticism-inspired cover of Nuove Eterotopie, and also as a writer. Of all of them, she does consider herself part of the movement, but she will then tell me that she is and isn't. Like all the members, both male and female, with whom I have spoken, they do not see their collective as a dogmatic set of constraints, but rather an invitation to be ever exploring, ever expanding in all directions, ever hybrid, ever seeking how things connect. Much of the connectivist work is about highlighting not just connections, but the interstices, the glue, the fibers, the tissues, the links that hold seemingly disparate things, ideas, and people together. Among the compagni di strada are also internationally renowned Anglophone science fiction writers, such as Bruce Sterling of cyberpunk fame, and much more, and Ian Watson, and some of the best-known science fiction writers in Italy, such as Valerio Evangelisti, who you will be hearing later today, Luca Massali, Dario Tonani, and the late Vittorio Catani and Sergio Altieri. A number of cultural critics and scholars have found this collective to be of great interest, such as the recently deceased Giuseppe Lippi, who was the editor of the science fiction series Urania at Mondadori for many years, and he was my original co-editor for an anthology of Italian science fiction I'm doing for Wesleyan Press. Going slowly, but we'll get there, we're getting there. So Giuseppe Lippi, and then Salvatore Proietti, who's a professor of American Studies and Science Fiction Studies at the Università della Calabria, and he is now my current editor for the Wesleyan volume. The largest publishers of science fiction in Italy today, Mondadori and Delos, have not only published a good number of connectivist novels and anthologies, but have awarded members prizes for their works. And I'm just going to show a few covers here. Giovanni da Matteo, 2 of his works, Sezione P2 and Corpi Spenti. Cremo's Pulfagus, Fango dei Cieli, and a short story Invertito in the journal, in the magazine Robot. Francesco Verso has had great success. Idol won in 2009, but Livido has been translated into English and is having a lot of success. I wouldn't be surprised if it gets a TV series. I can talk about that book later if you're interested. And then Sandro Battisti and Francesco Verso both wrote short novels that were together published in this, so Il Sangue e l'Impero, but these are the 2 different titles for 2014. So connectivist anthologies, novels, and collections of poetry, many of which have been published by Cremo's Kipple Press under the imprint Avatar. Not all of them, but many, many, many of the connectivist works are published by Kipple Press with Avatar. They have a small distribution, but they do sell electronic and print versions in the hundreds. Here are a few. So I just wanted to show a few covers of these different texts by connectivists. They really have good production values, and they are well promoted within the Italian science fiction community. The connectivists have eclectic, as you can see, far-ranging interests. Besides all of the inspirations I've mentioned, their roots are really more specifically in movements such as Fluxus, Surrealism, and Hermeticism, in theories such as Karl Pribram and David Bohm's holonomic brain, Ray Kurzweil's technological signalarity, Nick Bostrom's transhumanism ideas, Werner Vinge's focus on the augmentations of speed in the world, everything moving so fast, string theory, complexity theory, chaos theory, quantum mechanics. Many of their themes intersect with the esoteric, as I mentioned before, some with the erotic, the noir, and horror. Their influences from science fiction, modernism, postmodernism, as well as the pre-modern, of course Bruno, run the gamut. The poem Proprietà Emergenti by Marco Moretti offers a glimpse into the many avenues they travel. And I, again, will read this in full. And I put an image here by a connectivist artist from 2007. Da fibre di stringhe supercosmiche da quasar più antiche della nascita del tempo sono stato scagliato nel reame del divenire, prigioniero delle crudele gravità, languo nell'agonia di una profondità cristallina, circondato da onde oscure di materiale impalpabile. All'improvviso ascendo a una nuova intellecchia, rinasco in forma di organismo cibernetico, terrore criogenico, metallo spirituale, sovrasto le urla dell'universo moribondo, sfreccio libero tra intermundia d'orrore. As they celebrate potentials of human intellectual, spiritual, and physical enhancements and transcendental possibilities, the connectivists offer critiques of power structures, inequity, and fear of the other. Their politics are on the left, at times quite far left of center, and at times even approaching anarchic. While the majority of Italian science fiction, as many of you know, since the 1950s, has been written by left-leaning authors, there has been widely circulated ultra-right-wing science fiction produced in Italy in the last few decades, and even earlier. And that's something that is interesting and obviously worth talking about. But the connectivists are left and left of center. They stand out clearly against the right-wing trend. Cremo is particularly engaged, as can be seen in his 2012 novel, and I don't have a cover for his novel, Transhuman Express, and his situationist artistic creation of a micronation. It's called the Neorepubblica Caotica di Torriglia, and this is the passport that he created for it. That's a very long story that's quite fascinating. Given all of this heterodoxy and erudition, it's not surprising that some Italian science fiction readers find connectivism's works alienating. Although the Italian sci-fi world is small, it is active, and the connectivists have been labeled by some as pretentious, elitist, obfuscators, whose vision is not clear enough to merit an ism. And that's very harsh critique. But as Francesco Verso has said in an interview, the connettivisti are inductive, bottom-up, or rather, and I love this, inverse stripteasers, piling layer upon layer of imagery, questions, investigations, and connections in order to aggregate, jostle perception, implode the mind, and ultimately reach understanding of the human condition, humanity's purpose, and its future. This is not light, escapist science fiction. That said, a careful reader of the manifesto and their literary and artistic production as a whole will see that they are actually ideologically opposed to elitism and obfuscation. Giovanni De Matteo wrote an eloquent defense of connectivism, its openness, defense of connectivism's openness and focus on expansion and inclusion in his essay, La Guida Galattica per non connettivisti, which was published on the largest science fiction website in Italy called fantascienza.com in 2012. In 2013, an interview entitled Come scrivere storie connettiviste by Sandro Battisti explains that the main requirements are vertiginous flights of the imagination and an openness to possibilities and limitlessness. From anarchy and chaos, they believe, and this is an ancient belief, emerges harmony and order. Their goal, as stated in point 3 of their manifesto, is to scavare a fondo nelle carni dell'universo, penetrare sotto l'epidermide del mondo e raggiungere il midollo pulsante. subsequently to infect others through the virus of words, images, and equations that describe what truths they find there. The mystery of the universe, as they point out, as they say in point 4, is like the ungraspable, indestructible hologram. And I'll read this. Noi crediamo che il mistero dell'universo sia codificato in una chiave inafferrabile e indistruttibile, l'ologramma. Il principio olografico, il modello olonomico della mente è l'olomovimento. Dalla struttura della realtà ai nostri schemi di senso, la percezione conosce un solo paradigma che racchiude le istanze della relatività e dell'indeterminazione. As all our perceptions of the universe and its vicissitudes are subject to indeterminacy, they attempt to listen carefully to la voce dei morti e la musica che emerge da tutte le cose del mondo. The final point of the manifesto, like that of the futurists, sings again, but this time, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, of le strade deserte della notte, I monumenti congelati nel silenzio, etc. You could, at some other point, I'm happy to share this, and you can find this online, the whole manifesto. But the very closing words, so down towards the end, of the manifesto, of the last point 10, offer a final insight into who these writers see themselves to be. And I love this. Siamo antenne puntate nel vuoto, variabili impazzite, violini mal accordati, cronoscopi fuori fuoco. Their identification with guardians of fallen angels, lone wolves of the stars, and adrenaline pulses in the cables of reality becomes more clear. They are champions of the heterodox, out-of-the-box, shadow side, and the other as means to reach harmony, truth, and unity, and understanding. The last line of the manifesto says that they are living nella connessione protesi verso il futuro in order to become everything. They are like a node in the Kabbalist Sephirot tree, which, as you can see on the right, this is a version of the Sephirot tree, and I'll just put this on top of it. This is more commonly what we see as a Sephirot tree with the Hebrew Sephirot on top. So the Sephirot tree in which the divine reveals itself and creates the various levels of reality. A part of a web that offers and holds a higher order of consciousness for those ready and willing to join the post or transhuman. In this time of global crises and globalism, their work shows the value of making meaningful connections within the chaos of the physical and metaphysical worlds. I would like to end with a brief, very brief connectivist poem by Paolo Ferrante that recalls Bruno's sonnet and the themes of memory and imagination guiding this conference. Quando le nostre ossa impazziranno, ci germoglieremo I gangli di petali, le remore di corpi ci accadranno. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Saber. That was wonderful, and so many things to talk about and think about from that interconnection, I would say, of many genres and ideas. I really enjoyed that. I don't see any questions yet, but maybe people are processing right now. So before we dive into that, I just had a quick question about the technology and its place within the movement, because I noticed that in the manifesto there were some clear sort of anti-technological sentiments there, but then later on you were showing some photos, and a lot of science fiction has to do with, you know, sort of like that fusion of man and machine that is, you know, what we view as like very futuristic in that sense. So I'm wondering, is that sort of a conflict that is done on purpose, or is it something that has emerged because of two different streams of thought within the movement, would you say?
Well, there's definitely, absolutely different streams of thought within the movement, and that's their very loose, open philosophy. But I would say that there is, as with many science fiction writers, a love-hate relationship with technology, and a sense of fear of what it can do to us if not handled properly and thoughtfully. So what you will see is a back and forth movement in that regard, where they will see it and use it for uplifting purposes. It has that potential, and also to destroy us.
Is there any sense that maybe that that back and forth, or maybe that division between some people that might be pro and some people that might not be so in favor, it has anything to do with like a generational gap by any chance, or is it more?
I wouldn't say that it's different groups that are pro and contra. It's more that within each person there is the attraction to new technoscience and to the new, and to what new visions that can afford us. How can we see more, hear more, learn more? And so on that level, the same person might be attracted to it and then take a few steps back and fear it. And so, I mean, good science fiction writers, again, most of them, I believe, are sitting in this binary kind of love-hate. So, but the generational, they're pretty much all of one generation. I'd say they're all in their 40s, maybe at this point some 30s, and some going a little bit towards the 50s. But this group that started in the early 2000s, they're if they started in their 20s and 30s, they're upwards of 50s now. But there are older people who are interested in their work, and those are more the scholars who are not producers.
Wonderful, thank you. That's it does seem sort of like, I guess we all have that relationship with technology where we want it to do so many things for us, and then as soon as Zoom isn't working, we immediately resist.
Hate it.
Technology. Yes, exactly. So yeah, I think that we have a question in the chat. Oh yes, here we go. From Professor Parker. Thank you for this fascinating talk. 2 questions. So the first is the phenomenon of the connectivists a distinctly Italian phenomenon? And secondly, why do you think women have left the group? Do they see themselves as lone wolves?
Well, this is so both are great questions. One of the things that I have been thinking a lot about over the last bunch of years, I'd say about 10 years that I've been thinking about Italian science fiction, is what makes Italian science fiction unique? Does it have a particular flavor, bend, inclination because of the writers growing up in a particular environment, being educated in a particular way? What does science fiction look like that's different than American science fiction, Russian science fiction? And there's a lot we could say about it. A few quick things that I want to say right away from my research that I have found is that at least so far, the early research I've done from Italian science fiction through the 60s and 70s and early 80s, there are actually more women than I would have expected. Now, this is not the connectivists. I'm talking about earlier science fiction. And more examples of aliens that are good, which I think is an interesting question I need to explore. So I feel that there are some peculiarities to Italian science fiction. A lot of it is linked with questions around the weight of history and identity with the past, and worries about the future that are different from a society that gives much more money to science and is looking towards the future. I mean, the futurists were an interesting moment in the history of Italian science fiction. So I could go on and on. I mean, I've written about this, and other people are writing about this in terms of what makes Italian science fiction unique. In terms of the women, it seems to me so far that the women who have been, connected to the connectivists are science fiction, noir, horror, new weird writers who meet them, find a moment of reflect something that they resonate with, and they're happy to be a part of it, but then they go back and into their own worlds, and they're not part of this sort of planning group of events and conscious writing of things together, though more are joining. I have not come up with a theory yet as to why this particular kind of movement would be less attractive to Italian women science fiction or speculative fiction writers. And it's something that I'm going to keep pursuing. I actually was speaking with Megan Tomlinson yesterday, who we talked about this very issue. And I'd be very curious if any of you who are listening to this podcast, to this conference, have done work around questions of this issue about women in collectives in Italy. If there's something about is it more about the collective or more about the particular ideology that the connectivists pose? So thank you, Professor Parker. Those are great questions.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question from Professor Somigli as well. Great keynote, thank you. I'm wondering if you can say more about the politics of the group. Noi saremo tutto is from the International and a reference to Evangelisti. So I'm wondering what kind of political interventions the connectivists have engaged in. I don't know much about them, but I was struck by how the rhetoric of the lone wolf, etc., harked back to more romantic individualism than the collective politics we shall be all suggests.
That's great. Oh, I love how, thank you, Professor Somigli. That's a great juxtaposition. Again, they play with these binaries between the lone wolf and we shall be all. So I think, yet again, it's this desire to have their cake and eat it too, to have it both ways in a good sense, not in a entitled sense, in the sense that the individual is important in terms of who we are and what we bring to anything we write or create, but also the connectivists want to see an ability of humans to embrace each other and sort of cohabitate as individuals in a connected environment. So politically, I just know, I haven't read political writings that they've done beyond some collaborations actually with Valerio Evangelisti in some of his journalism as well. They are not activists front and center, but they are left-leaning in the sense of wanting to see more kind of socialist environments than a kind of individualist environment. So yes, it is a bit of a paradox, and they do play in paradoxes.
It makes sense. It's also like connected to the fact that like that anxiety of seeing funding go to science as opposed to the arts and that sort of, so like it's all sort of connected. There you go. Let's see if we have, yes, we have one more question here. Oh, from Professor Anne Urbanchi. Thank you for this fascinating talk. Have you considered any Renaissance forefathers for this group? You mentioned Giordano Bruno. Is there complementarity despite the centuries that separate us?
Thank you, Professor Urbanek. I think very much so. And I think this is the reason I was attracted to them. I mean, I, of course, love science fiction, and I read it, and I watch it, and I write about it, and I teach it. But there's something about, especially the manifesto itself, that absolutely harkens back to utopian thinkers, to Campanella, so Bruno Campanella for sure. I see Alberti, much of work I've done on Alberti has been about his innovative thinking that's always pushing forward, and the quid tum, the what's next. I think that also this question of the humanist and humanism. So, right, if you're looking into, for example, Renaissance humanism and trying to think about what the human meant in the Renaissance, huge question, but you can look at it by person, by individual, or by city, or by groups of people. The kind of new humanisms that have arisen in the last 10 years, from the post-human to the transhuman to the infrahuman, et cetera, that I see also a link between Renaissance thinking about the individual, sure, but also the role within civic society, which is so central to Renaissance humanism, as part of what's happening in the connectivist too. And then just to say another thing, a lot of Neoplatonism that you see emerging in the Renaissance, so people from Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. So many of the Renaissance thinkers that start to bring in Kabbalah and different mysticisms that are being translated and rethought, Hermeticism. So when I said Hermeticism, it wasn't just the poetic movement, it was also the ancient Egyptian revival of that kind of Hermeticism. All of that is, especially, and I'm going to say this with Giovanni de Matteo, he is an incredibly learned individual, scientist by training, engineer by training, so science-minded, but incredibly well-read, and then a number of them are also deeply interested in mysticism and esoteric traditions, which they draw from the Renaissance as well. Long answer, sorry.
No,
yes,
that was
there's Professor Terpstra. He says it all goes back to the Renaissance. Yes, it does.
True. It's true. I was actually thinking that Pico della Mirandola, like would have been a connectivist in a lot of ways.
Yes,
I think that he would have
absolutely.
fit right in. Yeah.
Right. So the synchronism, right? Synchronism. How do you find nodes of commonalities, nodes of similarities between groups and individuals of difference? So that is what I think this group is trying to do, at least, in their philosophical project. In their individual works, they do it in different ways. But yes.
Wonderful. It does all go back to the Renaissance.
Yes.
And thank you, Professor Urbancic, for that wonderful question. Do we have any other questions? Oh, my colleague was just asking, you mentioned the libido. Yeah.
No, there isn't one planned. I could imagine one planned. I wish. And I would say, if you probably don't remember when I gave the list of the body parts, Francesco Verso, who wrote Livido, is the legs. And he's the legs because he is the most dynamic force in terms of promotion and professionalism, going to conferences. He started a publishing company a few years ago. He travels to China. He goes all over the world. He is in contact with a lot of people, and his work is getting read a lot more, in part because of his ability to be a great promoter of his work and others as well. A lot of international science fiction he's translating into Italian, which is exciting. So what I was saying is, hoping that Livido will be a Netflix series or something at some point in the future, but I've not heard anything.
Well, there's hope because in today's age is sort of like non-television television where everything can be done, like on smaller budgets. I think maybe there is hope for a small project for that going forward. Oh, we have some more questions. From Professor Elisa Brilli. Hello, Ariel. Wonderful talk. I do not have a question, but a thanks and a follow-up on feminist science fiction in Italy. I don't have an answer. I do not have anybody in mind. So maybe just like a quick follow-up on that is what...
I'm going to just a shout out to Professor Brilli. Thank you so much. If you have graduate students interested in working on this question, I'd be delighted to also work with them and talk with them and connect them, use that word again, to people in Italy who are working on this issue, because it is a very interesting one that I would love to at least support a scholar, if I can't do it myself, in uncovering.
Wonderful. And we have a question from Pablo. Thank you for the inspiring talk. Is technology then portrayed as a new form of magic, or are there differences between the two? A very interesting question.
I love this question. Thank you, Pablo. So there is when I teach science fiction, I often start out the semester with dozens and dozens of quotes about definitions of science fiction. And there are so many. And one famous one is any sufficiently advanced form of technology, something like this, is indistinguishable from magic, which is really interesting. If you don't understand it, it could be magic. Now, to walk back for a moment, there's also a number of definitions of science fiction by writers and publishers and others, scholars, that say science fiction is what could happen, but you wouldn't want it to. And fantasy is what can't happen, but you would like it to. So there's often a distinction in the speculative fiction world between magic and science. And again, if it's sufficiently advanced that you can't understand it, it seems like magic. But the magic world versus the scientific alien world, science fiction and fantasy. Now, to get to your question, Pablo, which is fascinating, there is no question that because of their interest in esotericism, the connectivists are, and I don't mean playing with magic in the sense of like playing with fire, but they are contemplating what magical thinking, magical forces, magical practices can be folded into the work that they do, which tries to look at the real world and making the world better, critiquing the world and making it better. So magic is in there in a way that helps this group straddle, I would say, speculative genres.
That's a great question. Thank you. So I think there was there was a second part to Professor Brilli's question. It just got, basically others were writing, and so it got pushed down. And so that's why I missed it. So she had said she wasn't thinking of anybody specific, but there are two titles which come to mind. The volume Maria Serena Sapegno, a cura di Laura Salvini, Figurazioni del possibile, sulla fantascienza femminista Jacobelli Pavona 2008, and the conference by the Società delle Letterate on Anna Enverna, Piera Vaglio Giors, Utopia e Femminismo, edizione Tufani Ferrara 2009. Right. If there are any women writers working now on this, they would know. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Professor Brilli, and my apologies for the missing the second part of the comment there. Professor Parker has another question. How are the connectivists viewed by other Italian, more establishment science fiction writers?
So they're not well known outside of Italy, besides Francesco Verso, and when Bruce Sterling and Ian Watson and other better known Anglophone writers have published stories with them and promoted it on their own websites. So they are not very well known. There is not a lot in translation. They're working on that, and they're working on the promotion of it. And what I'm seeing, actually, I mean, the group really started in the early 2000s. 2004 was their published manifesto. It's been a couple of, not 2 decades, but it's been, almost 2 decades now. I think that at this point, they're all still connected to their ideologies, and they continue to publish as a group in anthologies. And they have, their magazine hasn't been published for a number of years, and I'm not sure if they're going to revive that. It had 18 issues. I think that each member is also going off and doing their own thing, and it's going to be, I would predict, quite a while before enough of it is translated that the Anglophone world and the non-Italian reading world gets their hands on it. So the answer is there's not an opinion beyond Italy about the connectivists yet. And as I did mention, there are some science fiction readers and other writers in Italy who find their work a little bit difficult and obscure. That's what they said about Burnout too.
Exactly. Wonderful. Are there any other questions or any comments that anybody would like to put forward? Was there anything that you wanted to reiterate, anything that you thought was sort of the crux? Or
there's so much.
So much.
I also welcome people who are interested in any of the topics that intersect with these authors. If anyone does translation and is interested in working with them or reading their work, I can also help direct you to, the Kipple Press is where much of it's published, but their websites, but also translators, of course, would be wonderful to get their work out there more broadly.
Always good to know a translator or two. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. And once again, thank you to Professor Saber for your wonderful talk. This was really fascinating and so much to think about. So many connections are made and still to make. Thank you again. We're now going to have a short break and we're going to come back for our simultaneous morning panel starting at 11:30. Our moderator, Benedetta, will kindly add the link to the conference program in the chat, so you can click on that to consult it and see which of the panels you might be interested in. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for attending, and ci vediamo presto. Thank you.